Frank Lloyd Wright is known for his innovative structures. We saw a few weeks ago the Imperial Hotel in Japan. We saw Johnson Wax building, and we saw some of his cantilevers in the houses that he designed. So he has always been innovating both with the structure, with the materials, with the building techniques. And here in the Guggenheim, he achieved something that had not been seen before. The project is the result of many iterations, and finally it worked out. It took many years to get it approved and to make sure that it's not going to collapse, but it worked out. So how does this structure work, John?
Well, interesting you said getting it approved, and it was actually Robert Moses who was sort of the great controller of most of New York's infrastructure to intervene with the building department. You cannot have an opening from one floor to the next because a fire will spread. So this is obviously open from one floor to the next. And they managed to say, well, it's actually just one story with a balcony running around it. So that's how they got by the fire code. But that was a real effort. But interestingly here is, how does this thing actually stand up? So for any of our students who have visited the building, think back and did you notice what holds it up? Okay. And first thought might be that the exterior wall could be a continuous tube, but notice that doesn't come all the way down. And notice that there are breaks in that. So that's not what's going on. That exterior wall is not the structure. At one time, Wright considered the whole thing being like a giant spiral spring, but that would have driven an engineer crazy because the force would have to go around and around before they got to the ground. I had my engineering professor, when I was a student, said, you don't want to take the forces for a walk. You want to get them directly to the ground as quickly as possible. Another consideration was to have columns on the inside, and of course that would have been very unhappy in terms of the spatial experience. So here's how it works. We see here these little fins sticking out of the round spiral, and notice them here. We see these fins every several feet. That's the structure. That's the, here you see these fins, that's the structure. And so we have these fins, and let's cut to me. And so here we have these fins. These come down, they're vertically all the way up and down. And then we span from fin to fin. And then where we walk is cantilevered out from that span. So there it is. The fins are the vertical structure. We span between them, and then we cantilever out for the walkway and the rim of the balcony. Now, interesting little device here. There's a space, this seemingly parapet, the lower part of that is actually containing the air conditioning, right. And the architect Louis Kahn would never allow that. He would want to tell us that this lower part is concealing the air conditioning, the upper part is parapet. He might make a slit in the parapet that just went down as far to the walkway to distinguish. That's what he does at Salk. Wright doesn't mind confusing these two, and he does the same thing at Johnson Wax. So that's the structural secret of the Guggenheim, what's holding it up. Here we see the excitement of the great concrete pour for putting it together. Here we're coming up to the hairpin forms on the skylight. And again, Wright saw the completion of the building, but was not there for the opening. So if you visit the Guggenheim, was this structure clear to you?
Well, it's quite amazing that they were able to build this in the 50s when there was no computers and no way to test the structure, whether it would work or not, and probably very hard to calculate it now. So most of it was probably building models, testing the models, putting them under stresses, and figuring out when it's going to collapse to find out where exactly to put the fins and how to make it. So it's still pretty amazing, when you are inside, that this space is holding together. And interestingly, the structure, it's so well integrated that it provides space for paintings, because when you go to the upper floors, the structure opens up. You know, in the bottom, these ribs are just like pinpoints.
They get thinner, yeah.
They get thinner. No?
Which
So
is counterintuitive. You'd think the column should get bigger as it comes down.
exactly. So he completely inverted it. No, so but somehow it's working. And on the upper floors, they become wider and wider. So when the further we go on, the more space they provide for the paintings, which is quite interesting, because on the upper floors you can put paintings on the actual structure, you know, and use it as a display, and those are interestingly horizontal on the bottom and horizontal. So when you're standing in front of the structure, the way the floor is perfectly horizontal at the place where the edge near the structure.
So here's an assignment for our students. When you're in New York, visit the building and spend a few hours there walking through it, and think about all the things that Yvonne just said about, you know, how the experience changes on every loop of the spiral, that the configuration, the proportions of the spaces continually differ.
In terms of space, no, I was wondering how you would explain this, no, because this is a linear museum, so a little bit like Le Corbusier's Museum of Infinite Growth. No, it's also spiral, but it's a square spiral. So what it does is requires you to go in certain sequence. So it's not a network museum like, for example, the one that Louis Kahn has at Yale, where you can go from room to room and you can cross from one epoch to another, or the Met, for example. Here, you're bound to this sequence and the spiral, so you can't necessarily see what's above or below you. You have to follow the sequence, no? Which for a museum it's quite successful, but for curators, probably it presents certain limits.
Well, but it's also very rich, because you can see across
Yes.
what's coming. And you can drop out of the spiral and go to the other galleries and then come back in again before you go around. And when Wright did the museum, not many people went to museums. So the idea was you take the elevator up and walk down.
Oh,
Well, there's
that
no
was
way
it.
you're going to do that today. I mean, you could barely get into the place. There's lines out front.
right,
You
right.
have to wait for that elevator. You'd be waiting half the day. So that elevator is useless today, because you could get about 6 people in it, and we're talking monster crowds today. So
Sure, yeah.
totally changed the experience.
So what people do today is they actually
You
walk
have
up
to walk up.
and then walk down, right?
Right,
Which
right.
is good, because you see it twice, right?
Right.
And you see it in one direction, and then you see it in the opposite direction. No? So
Right.
it's pretty amazing. Well, I would say that this is one of my favorite buildings in New York and probably in the world. No, and it's pretty amazing what he has achieved at the end of
Sure.
his life, and we're so lucky to have him live
We
that
got,
long.
and we've got more coming.
We do, yes. So thank you for the Guggenheim, and if you ever get a chance to visit New York, please come and see the Guggenheim and learn more about it. There's nothing like the experience of the building in person, being there and feeling it and walking through it. So, you know, yeah, definitely, if you can, visit it.